promised his supporters, and he's keeping that promise, as we've seen from what's happened this Friday. But could it all backfire if those supporters now have to pay more for goods, especially things like gas and oil?
You know, that's a great question. And really, that was the big question during the campaign last year here in America. Uh, how would each candidate deal with inflation? Republicans, led by Donald Trump, assailed Kamala Harris and the Democrats for not having a plan and calling it Bidenomics and saying that the inflation in the economy was spinning out of control. When I think in reality, at the end of Donald Trump's first term, he did this. He engaged in a tariff war with China that many U.S. Economists and global economists said would lead to inflation. And in fact, much of the inflation that we saw here in the United States from 21 through 24 was related to those tariffs against China. And so looking at that and thinking that as a context, as a framework, it is very possible that the price of goods and services here in the U.S. will continue to rise. We've already seen that over the last week. Here in America, we often joke about the price of eggs, and we've seen the price of eggs go up, and I think we will see, at least according to Goldman Sachs and many other leading economists, I think we can really expect to see a negative impact on the U.S. economy.
Well, what about the other countries involved here? Because if this does result in a trade war with Canada, which is something that we did see during Trump's first term, there were tit-for-tat tariffs, which both countries actually ended after a year. But how does it then affect that relationship between Ottawa and Washington, D.C.? Because Canada could also lose more economically going forward.
Absolutely. You know, our relationships, ours being the United States, our relationship with other countries has already been strained in many respects. And I think we saw many world leaders express concern about this over the time frame between the election and the inauguration. But that being said, I think we've already seen a bit of instability in the Canadian government brought on by Donald Trump in the way of former Prime Minister, or semi-former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, losing his job. He was already on shaky ground, but there was a big rift within his party, particularly between he and the finance minister, on how to deal with Donald Trump and the prospect of tariffs. And in Canada and the government there, they didn't feel that Trudeau was strong enough to manage and deal with Donald Trump, so they made a decision to try to remove him as prime minister. And I think now that Donald Trump is moving forward with this, we can see even more instability in the Canadian government and certainly strain on that relationship. Then when we turn the page and look at China, whether we're talking about TikTok or Temu or any number of matters, putting a tariff on goods with China will certainly strain the geopolitical relationships there. And I think other global leaders, particularly those in Mexico and other places that are major trading partners with the U.S., have to ask themselves, are we next, and how will this impact our economy?
And Trump has said that the EU will actually be next. He is looking at imposing tariffs on them. He has threatened tariffs against BRICS nations if they also move towards using their own currencies rather than the dollar. But all of this, Trump says, will also help stimulate things like manufacturing in the United States. One of the things he said a few days ago was drill, baby, drill, which is, of course, referencing oil and gas there. And he wants to boost those sectors. Are the tariffs then part of that move to develop those sectors in the U.S.?
Well, potentially, but none of those will be developed overnight. Whether you're talking about finding new oil fields and drilling and getting enough oil from that to make a difference, or to launch manufacturing plants across the U.S. to offset the drop in imports from other countries, that takes time. And also, it costs an exorbitant amount of money. Listen, the reason why we live in a global economy and why globalism and trade markets and trade agreements such as NAFTA and CARICOM and other trade agreements were instituted 30 years ago was because, particularly from the angle of U.S. companies, they could produce their goods for far less than other countries and allow them to either keep prices low and or keep the profits for themselves. And so I've heard many people, or a few people, speculate that, well, you know, the companies are just simply going to absorb these costs and Americans won't feel the difference with that. And that's not the case. It has not been the case. The companies, private industry is going to make the profits because they have a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders to maximize profit. And so they will most likely pass those costs on to to consumers. And that includes the cost of building new manufacturing centers, plants, and facilities, hiring new workers, and creating sort of distribution channels. Again, all those things take time, and all those things take money, and someone's going to have to pay for it. And it's most likely going to be the U.S. consumer.
Yeah, no one does seem to have the responsibility to protect consumers. But Fred, Trump has been in office for 11 days now. Overall, what do you make of his actions over this time, keeping his promises to his supporters?
Well, he has indeed worked to keep his promises to his supporters, whether it was dealing with diversity, equity, inclusion matters, or whether it's dealing with the tariffs, or whether it's dealing with immigration. Now, the question is, what is the impact, short term and long term, on him keeping those promises? In the short term, we've seen just this week a serious set of shockwaves sent through the U.S. economy when he issued executive orders to pause all federal spending. And that impacted everything from the Department of Defense all the way down to the Medicaid or the social services organizations and education centers here in the U.S. It really instilled a bit of chaos into the system, and people just were not sure what to do because the executive orders were vague, and many of them have been, well, vaguely, and some would say poorly written. With that being said, there are a great number of his supporters who, I would venture to say, almost all of his supporters are largely supportive of his actions because they voted for him and he's doing what he said he would do. Now, once we start to feel the consequences of those, whether it's through paying more at the pump or paying more at the grocery store or through whatever the impacts are of having strained relations with other countries, it will be interesting to see what happened. But I'd like to remind our viewers that 4 years ago, when Joe Biden and Kamala Harris ran against Donald Trump and then Mike Pence, Americans were not in love with Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, but they were exhausted from these 25-hour news cycle that was Donald Trump and his erratic behavior or his chaotic type-based policies that created chaos. And so I think what we're going to see first here in America is people remembering why we did not vote for Donald Trump 4 years ago or 5 years ago, and then having to make a decision because we're really just at the beginning. As you mentioned, 11 days out of a 4-year term. And so I think that people are going to have to make a decision. And we saw that this week once in the aftermath of him issuing those executive orders. People call their Congress members, they call their senators, governors call the White House, and it ultimately led in what some called a rescinding of those executive orders around the freeze. And this is a time where Americans are going to have to be more vigilant and more active and watching what happens with our government.
Yeah, certainly interesting times ahead. Fred Hicks, political strategist, great to get your take. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.